Imagine managing the food supply for hundreds of hungry knights, servants, and nobles in a massive medieval castle. There were no refrigerators, no freezers, not even ice boxes, yet these stone fortresses somehow kept food fresh for months, or even years. It sounds impossible today, right? But for centuries, castle kitchens mastered the art of food preservation, using surprisingly sophisticated methods that allowed them to store enough provisions to feed over 1,000 people for half a year. So, how did they do it? Let's start underneath the castle. Medieval castle builders were onto something brilliant when they dug deep beneath their fortresses. These massive underground cellars turned out to be nature's refrigerator, maintaining a steady temperature around 55 degrees Fahrenheit, 13 degrees Celsius, year-round. The deeper they went, the cooler it got, and castle designers took full advantage of this natural phenomenon. The cellars weren't just simple storage rooms. They were carefully planned labyrinths where different foods found their perfect homes at different depths. The lowest levels, reaching temperatures in the high 40s, stored milk, cheese, and fresh meat. A few steps up, you'd find the wine storage, and believe me, keeping the noble's wine fresh was probably more important than keeping the meat from spoiling. The upper levels housed hardier items like roots, apples, and preserved goods. These underground mazes were so vast that servants regularly got lost in them. They started leaving chalk marks on the walls to find their way back. Medieval breadcrumbs, if you will. One particularly unfortunate servant in Dover Castle was missing for 2 days before they found him sleeping next to a wine barrel. His excuse, "I got lost and the wine helped me stay warm." He kept his job, surprisingly enough. Not everything went smoothly in these underground food vaults. Rats were a constant menace. One castle record mentions losing an entire winter's cheese supply to a rat invasion. And then, there was the flooding. Nothing ruins your day quite like finding your roots cellar has become an underground pool. Speaking of preservation challenges, while these cellars were impressive, they weren't perfect. Which is exactly why salt became medieval Europe's most valuable food preservation weapon. Ever wondered why we say someone's worth their salt, or why we get a salary? Both phrases come from a time when salt was literally worth its weight in gold. Medieval castles went through mind-boggling amounts of the stuff. Records show that one average-sized castle would use up to 5,000 pounds of salt each year just to keep their food fresh. That's enough salt to fill a small bedroom. The castle's salt master, yes, that was a real job, knew exactly which type of salt worked best for different foods.
Fine white salt was perfect for preserving dairy and delicate meats, while coarse sea salt was the go-to for tough cuts and fish. The science behind it is pretty simple. Salt pulls water out of food, and out of any bacteria trying to spoil it. No water means no spoilage, which means happy, well-fed castle residents. Salt merchants became the medieval equivalent of tech billionaires. 1 pound of good salt could buy you a whole sheep, and the most successful salt traders owned entire fleets of ships. Of course, this led to some creative salt crimes. There are records of merchants caught selling fake salt made from ground white stones. Talk about taking a salt and battery to a whole new level. Castle doctors even used salted foods as medicine. Got a headache? Try some salted fish. Stomachache? Preserved lemons might do the trick. Though considering medieval medical practices, the salt was probably the least weird thing they prescribed. But salt wasn't the only way castles kept their food fresh. Sometimes they took a more smoky approach to preservation. The medieval castle smoking yard was like a prehistoric barbecue joint, minus the paper napkins and arguing about sauce recipes. These dedicated smoking houses, processing up to 200 pounds of meat per day during peak seasons, sat just outside the castle walls, far enough to prevent fire hazards, but close enough to keep an eye on. Court records show that a castle housing 150 people needed about 18,000 pounds of smoked meat to make it through winter. No wonder the smoking houses were guarded. You wouldn't want someone sneaking off with your winter's worth of smoked bacon. Each type of wood used for smoking brought its own special flavor to the party. Oak was the go-to choice for most meats. It burned slow and steady, creating a rich, deep smoke that could preserve meat for up to 4 months. Applewood got saved for special occasions, perfect for smoking wild boar or venison for the Lord's fancy feasts. Alderwood was the fish's best friend, giving salmon and trout that delicate, smoky taste we still love today. The castle smoke master knew exactly which wood to use and when. Timing was everything in the smoking game. Late autumn saw the smoking houses working overtime, with 3 to 4 smoking chambers running simultaneously. The process wasn't quick. Some cuts of meat hung in the smoke for weeks, with hams taking up to 3 months to fully cure. Castle records show smoke masters working in shifts, keeping the fires going day and night. The funny thing is, many of these medieval smoking techniques aren't that different from what modern barbecue masters use. The main difference: medieval smoke masters didn't have to worry about posting the perfect brisket pic on social media. While smoke worked wonders for meat and fish, vegetables needed a different approach, one that involved a lot more effort. Medieval castle kitchens took pickling to a whole new level. Archaeologists have uncovered massive pickling vessels in castle ruins that could hold up to 100 gallons each, enough to pickle 800 pounds of vegetables at once. That's a lot of medieval pickles. Records from Dover Castle show they pickled about 40 to 60% of their yearly vegetable harvest, turning their castle gardens into a year-round supply of vitamin C. But forget about just cucumbers and onions. Castle cooks pickled everything they could get their hands on. Cabbage, of course. Turnips, you bet. Eggs and beet juice, absolutely. And they turned a striking purple color that probably made more than a few castle kids giggle at dinner. Some castles even pickled imported fruits like lemons and oranges, treating them as precious commodities that only the lord and his family got to enjoy. One medieval cookbook mentions a cranky baron who threatened to throw his cook in the dungeon for serving his specially pickled plums to the common soldiers. The castle gardens weren't just for show. They dedicated whole sections to growing herbs specifically for pickling. Dill, garlic, and mustard seeds were castle gardening staples. But the real MVP was vinegar production. Every serious castle had its own vinegar-making operation, usually tucked away in a corner of the castle, because, let's face it, fermenting vinegar doesn't smell like roses. The pickling process was so important that many castles employed a dedicated pickle master who kept detailed records of every batch. These medieval recipe books survived centuries, showing us exactly how they did it. Some of their techniques were surprisingly advanced. They knew that adding grape leaves to pickle jars would keep the vegetables crispy, a trick many modern picklers still use today. Speaking of preservation techniques that stood the test of time, there was one sweet solution that medieval castles couldn't get enough of. In fact, it's so stable that archaeologists have found it's still edible after thousands of years. Medieval castle folk knew all about honey's supernatural preservation powers, which is why they maintained extensive bee yards, about a quarter-mile from their walls. These hives weren't just tucked away for safety, they were strategically placed near flowering meadows and orchards. A typical castle's bee operation included around 100 hives scattered across several locations, producing enough honey for both food preservation and medicine. Castle beekeepers lived in small cottages near their hives, making them the only skilled castle workers who didn't actually live inside the fortress. They got extra rations of ale. Apparently, medieval folks thought drinking helped prevent bee stings, and surprisingly, good pay. The castle infirmary kept its own separate honey stores, using specific types for different treatments. Light spring honey went to treating coughs and wounds, while darker autumn honey was saved for preserving fruits and meats. They even created specialized honey-preserved foods for sick patients. Fruits preserved in honey were a medieval hospital's version of get-well-soon candy. Speaking of preservation, the castle kitchen used honey in surprisingly creative ways. They dipped fresh fruit in heated honey to create a protective coating, layer root vegetables between honey-soaked linens, and even pack fish in honey for long journeys. One medieval recipe book describes how to preserve entire geese in honey, though it doesn't mention how they kept hungry servants from sneaking spoonfuls of the sweet preservative. The science behind honey's preserving power is pretty incredible. It's got so much sugar that bacteria can't grow in it, natural hydrogen peroxide that kills germs, and it's acidic enough to stop most microbes in their tracks. Plus, bees add an enzyme that turns it into honey superoxide, making it practically immortal. No wonder medieval castles valued their beekeepers almost as much as their master builders. All this talk of builders brings us to another crucial aspect of castle food preservation: the very architecture of the castle itself. Every stone, every passageway, every window had a part to play in keeping food fresh. Medieval castle architects were basically playing a giant game of Tetris with food storage. Every single room had to be careful carefully planned. From the massive grain silos that could hold 20,000 pounds of wheat, to the tiny cheese caves that maintained perfect humidity. They even calculated room sizes, using a special mathematical formula based on the castle's population. For every 100 people, they needed roughly 1,000 square feet of specialized storage space. The real genius showed up in their ventilation systems. Castle builders created natural air conditioning using something called pressure differential ventilation. Fancy words for letting nature do the cooling work. They built tall, narrow shafts that ran from the deepest cellars to the highest towers. When the wind blew across the top of these shafts, it created a vacuum effect that pulled cool air up from underground. One castle in Wales was so good at this that servants would hang out in the storage rooms during summer to escape the heat. Pest control was built right into the walls. Builders installed special ledges and barriers that rats couldn't climb, created angled walls that made it hard for mice to run up, and even incorporated natural pest deterrents, like herbs into the mortar mix. Sometimes they'd build cat runs, narrow passages that only cats could access, to let their furry exterminators patrol between walls. The castle kitchen itself evolved from a simple room with a fire, to an intricate system of specialized spaces. The buttery, for storing drinks, not butter, the pantry, for bread and dry goods, and the spicery, for expensive spices, each had their own unique ventilation and humidity controls. Some castles even had special rooms just for aging cheese, with shelves angled to let whey drain properly. Though one castle steward complained in writing about the cheese room being too close to the lord's chambers, apparently some aged cheeses were a bit too fragrant for noble noses. But even the cleverest architecture was useless without the right people to manage it. Enter the small army of workers who kept this massive food preservation machine running smoothly. Running a medieval castle kitchen was like managing a small city. The kitchen staff hierarchy started with the master cook. Under him, about 50 workers kept the massive food operation running, with roughly 15 dedicated to food preservation and storage. The yearly salary records from one castle show they paid their preservation master, a specialized cook, the equivalent of 30 sheep. Not bad for keeping the noble's dinner from spoiling. The kitchen apprentices started young, usually around age 12. Before touching a cooking pot, they spent 2 years learning crucial preservation skills, like how to tell if meat was going bad by smell, tough first day on the job, how to rotate food stocks properly, and how to keep those pesky nobles from eating all the winter preserves too early. One apprentice's diary survives, complaining about having to memorize 200 different storage rules before being allowed to handle anything more important than turnips. Inventory tracking was seamlessly integrated into daily kitchen operations. Head cooks used tally sticks, wooden sticks with notches marking amounts, and parchment records. Each food type had its own tracking method. Wine barrels got chalk marks, grain got measured by standardized scoops, and preserved meats each got numbered tags. Archaeological digs have even found loaded dice near the hearth. Gambling during breaks? Anyone? And scratched recipes on kitchen walls. As organized as the kitchen system was, it faced its biggest test when the seasons changed. Each part of the year brought new challenges for food preservation. The medieval food preservation calendar kicked off in spring with a frenzy of pickling and smoking the last winter stores, just as they were starting to turn. By early summer, castle kitchens were processing fresh herbs, drying them in bundles from the rafters. Summer brought a parade of fruits and vegetables that needed preserving. Kitchen records show one castle processed over 2,000 pounds of fresh produce in a single August week. Autumn was preservation crunch time. The castle kitchen turned into a non-stop preservation factory, with different teams handling smoking, salting, and pickling simultaneously. They even held preservation festivals where the entire castle staff pitched in, though records suggest these festivals were just as much about drinking ale as they were about storing food. One castle document mentions a cook who accidentally pickled his keys after a particularly festive preservation party. Winter brought its own challenges. The castle's master cook had to carefully calculate how much preserved food to use each week. Too generous in December meant hungry times in March. Castle records show they divided winter into 3 parts. Fresh stores, early winter when they could still use the newest preserved foods, deep stores, midwinter when they relied on longer-lasting preserves and scraping by, late winter when meals got creative with whatever was left. Weather watching became a crucial skill. Castle staff developed detailed systems for predicting weather patterns, marking down everything from cloud shapes to animal behavior. One cook wrote that he knew winter would be harsh if the mice started stealing extra food before first frost, medieval weather forecasting at its finest. But even with the best seasonal professional planning, things could still go terribly wrong. When things went wrong, the famous siege of Dover Castle in 1216 tested their food preservation system like never before. The castle held out for over 3 months, largely thanks to their stored food supplies. But it wasn't just about having enough, it was about keeping what they had edible. When the castle's main cellar flooded during the siege, the kitchen staff had to quickly move tons of preserved food to higher ground. They managed it in a single night, though one unfortunate cook got locked in a storage room for 6 hours during the rush. Kitchen records reveal some creative emergency solutions. When rats chewed through grain storage bags, cooks started storing them in sealed clay pots. After mold destroyed an entire season's cheese supply at one castle, they developed a new system of rotating cheese wheels daily and rubbing them with vinegar. The medieval equivalent of quality control became serious business. Food tasters didn't just check for poison, they checked for spoilage, too. Detecting spoiled food was an art form. Cooks used all their senses. The sound of tapping on preserves jars. Different sounds meant different things. The feel of cured meats, too soft meant trouble. Even the color of pickled vegetables. One cook's manual warns, if your pickled eggs turn green, feed them to your enemy. At least they had a sense of humor about food safety. Castle records show they lost about 20% of preserved food to spoilage each year. Not bad, considering they had no refrigeration. When preserves did go bad, they had backup plans. Sprouting grains in castle windowsills, smoking whatever meat they could find, and turning questionable wine into vinegar. Looking back at these medieval preservation methods, it's amazing how many of them we still use today. These old preservation methods weren't just about keeping food from spoiling. They created unique flavors that we still crave today. That smoky taste in your fancy ham? Thank a medieval smoke master. Those artisanal pickles at the farmer's market? They're using recipes that castle cooks would recognize. Even your grandmother's secret method of keeping vegetables fresh might have medieval roots.